In the summer of 1924, a Swedish gold prospector took a trip deep into the woods of British Columbia. A few nights into his trip, he was visited by someone he did not expect, and found himself forcibly being dragged off into the dark woods. When his captor finally let him loose, the young prospector looked up and was met with 4 figures standing over him. 4 figures, tall and hairy. Join me in this episode as we look into Albert Ostman's story of being kidnapped by Bigfoot. Welcome back to Moonlight Lore, everyone. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins, and today we'll be sharing Albert Ostman's personal encounter of being kidnapped and held captive by a family of Sasquatch. In this episode, things will be a little bit different from our regular episodes, as the topic of this story can't necessarily be proven true or not, and we solely have to trust the word of Albert Ostman on what happened to him in those woods in his interview with John Green in 1957. So this, I suppose, is the part of the episode where I'll warn you to use your own discretion on if you want to believe this story or not. Ostman has said in the past that it is quite an unbelievable story, and he wouldn't blame those who don't believe him. It took him decades to muster up the courage to share it once he read others were starting to share similar stories of their own encounters with Sasquatch. So 33 years after the event, Albert Ostman told the world his story. As I mentioned in the intro before, Albert Ostman was a young Swedish prospector who traveled all the way from Sweden to Canada in the early 1900s after hearing of plentiful mines of gold found in the dense forest and mountains of British Columbia. So in 1924, Albert, now in his 30s, was working a construction job in Bowser, all while keeping tabs on logging and other construction jobs in the area in hopes of hearing news of possible mines being discovered for him to prospect. He had heard of some news regarding a mine somewhere north of Toba Inlet, a 35-kilometer inlet located north of Vancouver Island along the mainland BC coast. Albert said, when he had first learned of a possible mine in this area, he decided it would make for a great vacation along with the possibility of striking it rich. So he packed up his gear, tools, and rifle, and took the Union steamship boat to the small town of Lund. From what I've read, he spent a short amount of time here before venturing out, but he did manage to secure and hire an indigenous man to guide him to the head of the Toba Inlet, where Albert planned to set out alone into the woods. Recalling his time spent with the man, Albert described him as a very talkative old gentleman who enjoyed sharing his stories while they traveled. One of the stories the guide told Albert about was one of a white man who had found a lost gold mine and would bring large sums of gold into town to spend at the saloon, as he was a very heavy drinker. He would spend all his gold there and then return back into the woods to only emerge back out a few days later carrying a large bag of gold to repeat the routine. One day, however, the locals saw him wander into the woods, presumably to retrieve another sack worth of gold, but he was never seen again. Rumors started to spread he had been killed by a Sasquatch. A bit intrigued, mainly by the gold mine, but also because he had never heard of such an animal by the name of Sasquatch, Albert asked the indigenous guide what he was talking about. His guide explained to him in a serious tone, they have hair all over their bodies, but are not animals. They are people. Big people who live in the mountains. The guide went on to say his uncle had found footprints in the dirt that were 2 feet long, and another older local had seen one towering above 8 feet tall. Albert stared back at him in disbelief, but eventually responded saying, I don't believe in your old fables about mountain giants. It might have been true a few thousand years ago, but not nowadays. His guide simply responded saying, there may not be many, but they're still out there. According to Albert, they had arrived at the head of the inlet at around 4 in the afternoon and made camp at a nearby creek where the two made supper and continued to talk about the land. When it began to get late, the guide started to collect his things to leave Albert to his vacation. Telling his guide to look for him in 3 weeks' time at that same spot, Albert saw off his new friend and began to organize his belongings to begin his first night alone in the woods and travel deeper into them in the morning. The next morning, Albert grabbed his rifle but left his gear behind at the campsite to try and scout out some game to hunt further into the woods, and had seen a pass up the mountain that he wanted to check out. He spent most of the day with very little luck finding deer or any other game to hunt, or even finding a trail passing up the mountain, and decided to make his way back on a hogback, which is basically a small hill. It led back down to the beach where his camp was waiting for him. He checked his watch and saw it was about 3 p.m. when he finally returned to his site, and finished packing his gear to finally venture further into the forest. His equipment he had planned on using was a .30-30 Winchester rifle, a special homemade prospecting pick, which was an axe on one end and a pick on the other, a leather case for his pick which fastened onto his belt, and also a sheathed buck knife. Back at the town of Lund, he had stopped at the general store where he had stocked up on plenty of food for the few days he believed he would spend not able to find animals to hunt. In his pack, he had brought along some cans for sugar, salt, and matches to keep them dry. Food consisted mainly of canned items, except for a side of bacon, a bag of beans, 4 pounds of prunes, 6 packets of macaroni, cheese, 3 pounds of pancake flour, and 6 packets of Rye King hardtack, 3 rolls of snuff, 1 quarter sealer of butter, and 2 1-pound cans of milk, along with 2 boxes of shells for his rifle. Now, some of you may not be familiar with what Rye King hardtack or what snuff is, and since the snuff plays an integral part of Albert's story, I'll stop here to explain what these are. Basically, the hardtack were packets of crackers. The snuff was a form of smokeless tobacco meant to be inhaled through the nose, chewed, or placed in the mouth to simply produce saliva, and is commonly referred to as chewing or taking a dip of tobacco. And finally, of course, he had his sleeping bag that could be rolled up and placed on top of his pack while he walked, a ground sheet, an iron frying pan, and 1 aluminum pot to cook with. He figured the more of his canned food that he cooked, the more cups and cans he would be able to use later on for cooking. So once morning came, Albert moved as quickly as he could back up the hogback, but estimated his pack was close to 80 pounds and was only able to hike for an hour before having to stop for a rest. The whole morning continued on like this until he checked his watch and saw it was around 2 p.m. and decided to find himself another good place to set up camp. This would go on for about a week of Albert traveling around the BC mountain ranges, admiring the landscape, prospecting for minerals, hunting animals, and setting up different campsites at the end of each day. But eventually he managed to find the perfect site with 2 large trees, open space, a natural rock wall, and a small spring for water. He decided this would make a great permanent camp for his trip and began cutting down and clearing the brush away to make a comfortable sleeping and cooking space. In his words, it was a classy setup, but this is also when the strange things started to begin. According to Albert, he could be quite the heavy sleeper, and as he puts it, nothing could really disturb his sleep when he had a good bed to lay on, which might be why that night he hadn't heard an intruder enter his camp and go through his pack and gear. He says when he awoke in the morning, much of his things were disturbed and moved around to a spot where they had not been left before. Think it was probably just wild animal like a porcupine or raccoon moving his things. The next evening, he filled a magazine for his rifle, put some extra shells in his pocket, and laid himself and his rifle down on his makeshift bed, along with his leather shoes. The next morning, when he woke up again, he found his pack had been completely emptied out and turned upside down, hanging on the pole where he had left it the night before. In his story, he refers to porcupines as porkies, and makes reference that porkies like to chew on leather and look for salt to eat. But that night, his shoes were untouched, and the salt wasn't disturbed. But a package of prunes, along with a bag of pancake flour, was completely missing. This is when he started to suspect something larger than a porcupine. Suspecting maybe it was a bear at first, but then realizing it couldn't have been bears because typically bears would tear things up. They don't undo straps to get inside packs or carry away remains of packages or bags of food they steal. So it might have been a human somehow, but that seemed even more unlikely as he was in the middle of nowhere, days already into the woods. He decided to try and survey the area, looking for any potential tracks or any signs at all of what creature could have been visiting his camp and stealing his food. Not straying too far from his camp, maybe out of nervousness of what animal might be out there, or protectiveness over his things, Albert returned to camp and sat high on a rock and watched over his sight to see if the animal would return that day. Unfortunately for Albert, nothing came, and he was forced to gather up his things to pile near where he slept and got ready to settle down for another night. He made note that night it was very cloudy and it looked like some possible rain might be coming, so he packed his things under a nearby tree where he slept, drove his prospecting pick into the tree, moved his shoes inside his sleeping bag along with his gun and a few other supplies to consume during the night, because his intent was to stay awake during the whole night to catch whatever visitor was coming to his camp. He estimated he most likely had fallen asleep around 1 a.m. Hiking through thick forests and up mountains every day for over a week would make anyone tired, and with no sign of the visitor, it would have probably have gotten pretty boring laying in his bag all night, so the plan to stay awake would seem destined to fail. The night seemed calm, despite the possible incoming rain, and Albert was enjoying a deep sleep when suddenly he was awoken by something, or someone, picking him up in his sleeping bag. Albert says he was half asleep, still groggily trying to remember where he was, when all of a sudden it felt like he was thrown onto horseback, and he knew whatever he was on, he was walking away with him, deeper into the woods. Now, being carried away from his camp and further into the woods, Albert sat in his sleeping bag, left wondering what kind of creature had captured him. He then remembered he had put his knife in the bag with him that night. He felt around for it, but quickly realized he was sitting on it, and now unable to move in the tightened bag, there was no way to grab it. His rifle was inside with him as well, and he had already grabbed a hold of it with no intention of ever letting it go. He mentioned at times he could feel his pack sack touching him, and the cans were poking him in the back, so he knew at the very least he still had some of his supplies with him. Estimating for what seemed like an hour, Albert could feel he was being carried uphill, as he could feel every rise of every step. Albert said he could hear whatever it was breathing hard, and at times giving out the occasional small cough. And once he started hearing the creature cough, Albert had the shocking realization this creature must be one of those mountain Sasquatches his guide had told him about. Sitting in such a tight and uncomfortable position, Albert noted in his story he wasn't able to move at all in his bag, and that one of his boots, which had a hobnail in it as support for the sole, was sticking out and stabbing into his foot. He also made note of how hot he was getting trapped inside. He says, "It was lucky for me this fellow's hand was not big enough to close up the whole bag when he picked me up. There was still a small opening at the top. Otherwise, I would have choked to death." The pair continued traveling across the rugged mountain terrain, with Albert still in the sleeping bag being carried, drugged, and overall being tossed around while all he was wishing was the creature would hurry up and get to his destination. With nothing else to do, and to keep his mind off the pain of being drugged around on the rocks and his legs cramping, Albert tried to gauge the distance and directions he was being taken. But being trapped in the bag and unable to see, it was pretty hard to gauge the direction. All he knew was that they were moving at a moderate pace, even up and down hills and mountains, and around trees and over rocks. They must have been on the move for hours at this point, when all of a sudden, Albert heard talking he didn't understand, and was dropped and rolled down a sloped hill. He quickly stuck his head out of the now open sleeping bag, and gasped for a breath of cold mountain air, and tried to straighten his legs, but found they were too numb to walk. He rolled onto his back, and looked up at the sky, and saw it was still black, but the moon was still bright enough to illuminate his captors. Quickly trying to massage his legs to get life back into them, and grabbing his shoes to throw on, He quickly turned around and tried to get his eyes to adjust to the light and focus on the figure standing around him. From what he could make out, there were 4 of them standing around him, continuously chattering to one another in a language unrecognizable. Albert knew now he was in the presence of mountain men his guide told him about. He was sitting before 4 Sasquatches. Instantly, Albert's mind went straight to thinking of a plan on how to get away from them. His legs were starting to have some circulation back in them, but his left foot was incredibly sore where the hobnail on his boot was stabbing into it. He decided the best course of action was to stand and try to talk to them. With his rifle firmly grasped still in his hands, he asked in a tired and worried voice, "What you fellows want with me?" which was only met with more unrecognizable chatter from them. It was starting to get a bit lighter out now. With his eyes adjusting more and the help from the early dawn, he could now see them quite clearly. There was a total of 4 of them standing there, 2 big ones and 2 little ones. All 4 were covered in hair from head to toe, with no clothes covering them. The mountains surrounding him were starting to get clearer, so Albert looked down at his watch and saw it was 4:25 a.m., meaning he had been traveling for around 3 hours non-stop from his campsite. Knowing this information, we can only imagine how far he must have been from familiar territory, and how strong the Sasquatch must have been to carry a fully grown man and many of his items across rocky cliffs and through dense woods without even stopping. I think along with us, Albert knew he wouldn't be able to outrun or fight his way out of here. Eyeing the 4 of them up, Albert said they looked more like a small family. The old man who had seemingly carried him there, an older woman, and a young boy and girl. Even though he couldn't understand them, Albert got the sense that the 2 young ones were rather scared of him, and the older lady didn't seem too pleased at the older man having dragged him home. After a bit of discussion between them, all 4 walked away, leaving Albert standing there wondering what to do next. He checked his pockets and found he still had his compass and attempted to reason where their location was now that it had gotten a bit lighter out. He could see he was standing in a small valley or basin, which by his estimate was about 8 to 10 acres, surrounded by towering mountains, and on the southeast side was a V-shaped opening through the mountains, and deduced that must have been the way he had entered, and this was where he would have to escape to. But now, just standing in this valley, unsure what these hairy people wanted with him, and not entirely sure where to go after he went through the V-shaped opening, he decided to make himself comfortable and find a spot he could settle down and take a nap, as he was up all night and was very sore. He also decided this would make a great time to go through his inventory to see what he had managed to keep with him. Luckily, he found he still had quite a bit of his food left, with the occasional item missing like his prunes and macaroni, but he also found his prospecting pick was gone and figured it must still be embedded in the tree where he had left it. Also, his box of extra rifle shells was missing along with a safety box of a dozen matches. He had some shells he had put in his pocket the night before, but other than that, he would have to start rationing his things. As he was doing this, going through the remainder of his gear and setting it out, he noticed the young boy and girl were watching him from behind some juniper bushes, but paying them not much mind, Albert continued to take inventory of his things, but noticed all of his utensils were left behind. He realized if he was going to be staying here, he would also need to look for water. Albert grabbed his coffee tin and emptied the coffee into a dish towel and tied it shut. He grabbed his rifle and took the tin out looking for water and anything else that might help illuminate what he was doing in this valley with these people. He walked around for a bit and had managed to find a small cliff with a spring at the bottom of it, with water disappearing back underground. He grabbed himself a drink and plunged his tin can under the water to carefully carry it back to his belongings and to make himself a cup of coffee. When he approached his things again, he found the young boy was looking over his belongings, but seemed to be still a little afraid as he hadn't touched anything, but also found the others were fast asleep under some tree coverings with the ground covered in soft dry moss, and saw they had fastened their own blankets out of what looked like narrow strips of cedar bark packed with more dry moss. They looked quite comfortable laying there, Albert says. The first day, though, he says not really much happened. He had to eat his food cold, The young boy was coming closer to him and seemed more curious than frightened now. Albert says he took one of his empty snuff cans and tossed it towards him to see his reaction. According to Albert, when the boy saw the box coming at him, he sprang up as quick as a cat and grabbed it. He went over to his sister and showed her. They found out how to open and close it and spent a long time playing with it. Then he trotted over to the old man and showed him, where they had a long chatter. The next morning, Albert had made up his mind to leave the valley and try to find his way back to his campsite, even if he had to shoot his way out. He figured he couldn't stay long, as he only had enough food to last him until he got back to the inlet, where his guide was supposed to meet him. Even though he admits he didn't know the distance or the direction they were at, he would travel downhill and would have to come across civilization at some point. He rolled up his sleeping bag, put it onto his pack sack, packed the few cans he had left, and swung the sack into his back. He loaded up a shell into his rifle and started heading towards the opening in the wall of the mountain. After just a few steps in that direction, the old man sprung up, ran in front of Albert, and held out his hand as though he was going to push him back. Albert pointed at the opening in the mountain, insinuating he wanted to go out that way, but the old man stood there, pushing him back, and said something that sounded like "Soka, Soka." Albert said he backed up to about 60 feet, as he didn't want to be too close to this towering man, and he thought, if I had to shoot my way out, a 30-30 might not have much effect on this fellow. It might just make him mad. He only had 6 shells, so he decided to wait. There must be some better way than killing him in order to get out of here. Albert walked defeated back to his makeshift camp he had made there and started to brainstorm. He thought, maybe I could make friends with the young fellow or the girl. They might be able to help me. If only I could talk to them. Then Albert remembered a story he had heard before of a man who had saved himself from a mad bull by blinding it with snuff in its eyes. This could work, but how would I get near enough to this big fellow to put snuff in his eyes? So he decided, next time he got the attention of the young boy, he would give him his snuff box and leave a few grains of snuff inside, hoping he would give it to the old man to taste or smell. Maybe this would have some effect on him. This plan to incapacitate the old man might work for a little while, but that's only half of the problem solved. He still had to find his way out and down the mountain, and even then, which way would he go? Albert figured he was about 25 miles northeast of the Toba Inlet when he was kidnapped, and then the old man carried him for roughly 3 hours straight, which might make that another 25 miles in some other direction. He had his compass with him, and he knew if he traveled straight west, he would end up near the coast, and probably the same if he would head straight south. Albert at this point concluded he and this family of mountain men must be northeast of where his campsite was, and knew if he were to head southwest, he would eventually hit saltwater somewhere between the town of Lund and Vancouver. It seems so far in the story, Albert was relatively safe in the position he was in. How he described the story, he seemed to regard the mountain folk in good regards, and they seemed to treat him good enough, or at least as good as they were capable of, aside from kidnapping and keeping him there. But this plan Albert was thinking up, one might think it was rather on the impossible side of things. Could he really manage to get the older Sasquatch male to take enough snuff to incapacitate him long enough for him to escape? And could he really get past the 2 young ones and the mother? The next step was to travel in unfamiliar territory with really no idea where he was or how far he had to travel to make it somewhere where he could find other people. For anyone else, this might have been an impossible feat, but for a seasoned prospector and outdoorsman like Albert, it was another challenge he was eager to overcome. The next following day, Albert recalls not seeing the old lady until about 4 in the afternoon, but when he did see her approaching, she came home carrying arms full of grass and twigs from spruce and hemlock, along with some recognizable nuts Albert had seen around Vancouver Island before. During the day though, Albert says he spent a lot of his time observing the young boy climbing up the sides of the mountain cliffs better than any mountain goat he had ever seen. When he was up a good ways, he would pick some kind of long grass and would bring some back down for Albert to taste. Apparently, These blades of grass had long sweet roots that were quite delicious. When the boy would hand him the grass roots, Albert says in exchange, he handed him his tin box of snuff with about a teaspoon of snuff inside. The boy tasted it and went to the old man for him to have a taste as well. As the two chatted to each other, Albert says he started making a dipper out of an empty milk can and a stem from a tree. A dipper, as he references it, was basically a makeshift ladle he had evidently gotten plenty of practice making out in the woods out of various items he had or had to find. And apparently, the young boy found so much interest in the dipper, Albert tossed him the homemade cup and stick at the boy, who picked it up and ran off to show his father. A short time after, the boy came back up to Albert and pointed at the dipper and then at his sister. Albert figured he wanted him to make one for his sister as well, and since Albert had some peas and carrot cans, he went right to work making her one too. When he was done, Albert bent down at the spring and showed the two they could dip it into water and use it as a cup, to which both seemed very pleased with, so much so that the boy started to smile at him. With this, Albert took out a bit of snuff and chewed a bit, to which the boy had noticed and said a word along the lines of "ook," and pointed at his father. Albert got the idea that the old man liked the snuff he had before, and the boy wanted him to share that too. Albert motioned to the boy to go bring his father to him, but he believes he didn't understand him, and walked away towards his sister. By this time in the story, Albert figures he had been there for about 6 days, but felt as if he was building a good rapport with the young boy. During his whole story, Albert doesn't really refer to them as any kind of animal, but rather like mountain people, like his indigenous guide referred them as before. He considered them people, so the idea of killing the old man was weighing heavy on his conscience quite a bit during this time, because he knew if he wanted to escape this valley, it might have to come to that. The idea behind the snuff, however, well, Albert figured if the older fellow would happen to eat a lot, and he would have just so happened to die from the consumption, then his death would be on himself, not on Albert. Albert figured between the young boy who was quite friendly towards him now, the young girl who was still shy but also grown to be somewhat friendly, and the older woman who was a bit meek looking, he believed if he had to, he could escape with little to no resistance. And now at this part of the story, we finally get a good detailed description of these mountain folk here. As described by Albert, he says the young boy was probably around 11 to 18 years old, which yes is quite the age gap, but the sheer size of him makes me believe he was closer to 18 or even older. Albert stated he was about 7 feet tall and estimated he could have weighed up to 300 pounds. His chest would be around 50 to 55 inches, waist at around 36 to 38 inches. He had a wide jawline and a narrow forehead that slanted upwards. The hair on their heads was about 6 inches long, and the hair on the rest of their body was short but thick in places. The woman's hair on the forehead had an upward turn, as if purposely styled that way. At his best guess, Albert thought the older woman could have been anywhere between from 40 to 70 years old, and was also over 7 feet tall, but probably weighing around 500 to 600 pounds. From just looking at her, Albert figured she wasn't really built for beauty or speed, as she had very wide hips, and said she walked like a goose. And now moving on to the older man, we get a bit more detail of him more than the others. I'm assuming it's because Albert had been keeping his eyes on him, trying to plot how he was going to get past him. The first thing Albert makes reference to is his eye teeth, which is basically another way of saying his upper canines. He mentions these teeth were noticeably longer than the others, although still not long enough to be considered tusk-like. Standing at around 8 feet tall with a barreled chest, big humped back, and powerful shoulders, he was definitely an intimidating giant compared to any grown man Albert had ever seen before. Not only did he have a hulking figure, but his biceps were so enormous they tapered down to his elbows. Albert also notes his forearms were quite a bit longer than a common person's, but well proportioned to his body. His hands were very wide, with the palm being long and broad like a scoop, but his fingers were shorter than expected in regards to the rest of his hand. Looking closer at his hands, Albert noticed his fingernails were rough and long, resembling chisels. He also mentions the old man, along with the other three, had hair covering their entire bodies except for the inside of their hands, the soles of their feet, and the upper part of their noses and eyelids. In fact, they had so much hair, Albert says he never actually ever seen their ears. There was just so much hair drooping from their heads. During his time there spent in the valley, Albert also says he noticed when the boy was sitting down one day, the soles of his feet looked like they were padded like a dog's foot, but were so large he had no idea what kind of shoe they could have worn. From what Albert could determine in his time here, he didn't think this valley was their permanent home, that this might have just been a stop on their own journey when they had moved from place to place, searching for different kinds of foods at different locations. Albert says he never saw them actually eat meat or did any cooking. They mainly just foraged for their foods among the trees, bushes, and on the ground. But they did seem to know what was good to eat and how to find it. It was probably the right season for the sweet root longgrass and a few other plants in the valley, so it would make sense for this valley they were in would be a stopover for them. It also seems that these mountain people were very practical and never did anything without purpose. If the two older ones weren't looking out for food, they were resting. The two younger ones, however, were always on the move, either climbing or doing some other kind of exercise. Now, this might be a part of the story where some people might find a bit silly, but Albert says when the two young ones were playing or exercising, the boy would take hold of his feet with his hands and balance on his behind, then bounce forward. The idea behind the game, Albert thought, was to see how far he could bounce without his feet or hands touching the ground, and apparently, according to Albert, the young boy could make a 20-foot bounce. Although he wasn't mistreated in any way, Albert knew the day was coming when he would have to trick the old man to incapacitate himself so he could escape. And it was getting noticeable that the old man was getting closer to Albert, just like the young boy had been. He was also very interested in the snuff, which was a good sign for Albert. On that sixth day, when Albert was making some coffee and putting a pinch of snuff inside his lip, the old man and young boy came and sat quite close to him, to which he figured the smell of the strong coffee lured them over. Albert apparently made a big show of how good his coffee tasted to draw the pair in closer, and he pulled out a new, full box of snuff to break open. He says before he even got a chance to close the lid after taking another pinch, the old man reached for it. Now Albert was afraid it would waste it because he only had 2 more tins left, but he held out the box anyways, hoping he would grab just a pinch like he did. Instead of taking just a pinch, however, the old man grabbed the whole box and emptied it into his mouth, swallowing it all in one gulp, then licked the inside of the box clean with his tongue. After a few minutes of sitting and watching, the old man's eyes began to roll over in his head while he was looking straight up into the sky. It was definitely clear he was getting sick now. The old man grabbed the rest of Albert's coffee and emptied that into his mouth too, grounds and all. And when that didn't help, he stuck his head between his legs and rolled forwards a few times and then away from Albert. Once he was a good bit away, he began to squeal like a stuck pig. Albert knew this was probably his one and only chance of escape now, so he grabbed his rifle and said to himself, "This is it. If he comes for me, I'll shoot him plumb between the eyes." But the old man was heading towards the spring, obviously looking for water. Albert moved quickly and packed his sleeping bag in his sack with a few cans he had left. The young boy ran over to his mother and chattered loudly as she began to squeal too and started to run towards Albert. Albert ran to the V-shaped opening in the wall of the mountain and just made it to the other side before turning around and seeing the old woman running right behind him. Albert took aim with his rifle and fired a shot. She must have never seen or heard a rifle fire before, because as soon as Albert shot, but missed, she turned and ran back into the valley. Albert started running and quickly loaded another shell into his rifle in case she tried to run at him again, but as he occasionally looked back behind him to see if she was following him, there was no sign of her. With adrenaline flowing and the possible danger behind him, Albert traversed the mountains quickly and thought he must have traveled 3 miles in world record time. Using the sun to help guide his direction, he set off heading southwest into a canyon and decided to keep going until he was able to get to a ridge just ahead of him. Because of his light pack and the adrenaline starting to wear off, he wanted to get up somewhere high enough to rest so he could also see behind him to make sure the Sasquatch weren't following him. Luckily, he couldn't see anyone. When Albert finally got over the ridge and could see a fair bit away, he could see Mount Baker, which was a very good sign because he knew he needed to go that way. Though he was tired, he remained up on the ridge for 2 hours and kept vigil, and his gun in hand, to make sure the old man wasn't coming after him. At around 3 p.m., Albert started down the mountainside and said it was pretty easy to get down as it wasn't too steep and not too much underbrush. Once he made it to the bottom, he spotted a blue grouse and shot it for his meal for the night. I imagine he was probably pretty worried that the gunshot would signal his location, but he was also probably pretty hungry from traveling all day on an empty stomach and being dangerously low on food. He traveled down along a creek to the bottom of the canyon and was starting to feel a lot safer now that he had put a few miles between him and the family of mountain people. With the sun starting to go down behind the mountain, he decided to make a fire between 2 large boulders to hide himself in and to also roast his grouse. The next morning, he woke up feeling a little sick. With that grouse, sore legs from running and climbing so much yesterday, and sore feet from his dirty socks, Albert began to think if he was really going to be able to make it out of there. He packed up his things again and started up another mountain, but when he finally made it to the top, 6 hours had passed and it was far too cloudy to be able to see anything more than a mile. Albert still had an idea of where he needed to go, so after a rest at the top, he headed down the other side, which took about 2 hours to reach the heavy tree line where he took another rest. As he was sitting there and things got quiet, he started to hear noises coming from further into the forest. Not someone walking, but machine running. After listening for a quick minute, Albert realized someone, or a group of people, were doing some logging nearby. Albert began running through the woods now, following the noise. At times the machine would turn off, and he would have to wait until it was turned on again to start running in that direction. But eventually, he found his way to a camp and was met with confused and worried loggers who welcomed him into their camp. Albert told them he was a prospector who got lost, but didn't mention anything about being kidnapped and living with a Sasquatch family, worried they might think he was crazy. Albert stayed with them for the rest of the day and that night, and I assume he was quite happy to be sleeping in a warm, dry, safe, and comfy place with other people around him. The next day, Albert set off from the logging camp and headed down the road to the coast, where he was able to get a ride with the Union transport boat back to Vancouver. Albert says this was his last prospecting trip, and the first and only experience with what is known as Sasquatches. In this whole interview with Albert Ostman, the interviewer John Green states he felt Albert was being completely and totally sincere when sharing his experience. This is coming from a man who has accumulated hundreds of stories about Sasquatch and had interviewed plenty more people, so I would be more inclined to trust his opinion in regards to him trusting Albert. Also, to give credit to Albert, he even testified to a police magistrate and signed a solemn declaration that his experience was indeed fact, and he did live through it. But on the other hand, I will also reinforce the fact that this interview was done 33 years after the encounter. So there are more than likely a few things that were probably remembered wrong. If you or even I try to remember an influential event that happened to us even 10 years ago, I guarantee we couldn't remember every detail the way it exactly was. Which is why at the beginning of this episode I gave a bit of a warning to take this story with a grain of salt. Now, do I believe if this story is true? I believe there can be some truth in Albert's story, yes, but every little detail of the story makes me think he might have improvised a little to make it make sense to those hearing or reading about it. I do believe he encountered something in those BC mountains, but many critics of Albert are quick to nitpick the story away into what they might call simple imagination rather than any kind of recollection. The main reason why I don't necessarily want to say for sure if it was true or not is because Albert Ostman passed away in 1975, so he's not around to defend himself or his own story, nor is John Green around anymore to defend it either. I believe it would be unfair to try and pick apart his legacy now that he's gone. But what those creatures could have been, well, I just don't know. But I do want to say there are just so many stories coming from the Rocky Mountains about Sasquatch encounters and sightings. There's got to be, or at least used to be, some kind of race of giant humanoid out there somewhere. There are also too many reports of giant hairy people from different locations all around the world, like the skunk ape in Florida, the Yeti in Nepal, the Yowie in Australia, or the Yeren in China, to be considered just a coincidence. There's something we must be missing, and all the stories, encounters, and sightings must have some origin somewhere in our history. We'll just have to continue to be relentless in our pursuit for the truth of what's really out there. Hey there everyone, I just wanted to jump in at the end of the episode to let you all know that Moonlight Lore has an Instagram page where I've been and will continue to post pictures of and relating to the specific episodes talked about on the podcast. If you're interested, feel free to give me a follow on there at Moonlight Lore Podcast. And if you're wondering how you could help support and grow the podcast, simply by listening does just that. But if you want to go even further, leaving a 5-star review on whatever app you're listening to this on, and by sharing this podcast with your friends and family who you think might be interested, would also help immensely. I appreciate all of you for listening to Moonlight Lore, so thank you, and I hope you've been enjoying it. Take care and stay safe.